Hello, welcome back to another YouTube video. Today I'm doing my 25.7 Toplane Tierlist. So, if you have content, like, subscribe, and let's get into it. There were a lot of changes this patch. We had the full change to Yorick. We had a pretty big follow-up change to the likes of Gwen. Neferi still see some play in the top lane. They ended up having to hotfix nerf her again because she was still performing too well. Yorick ended up being hotfix buffed, but there was like a bunch of different things which kind of went into that. Olaf had a cast time reduction on his E, scaling with attack speed. Shen gained bonus damage to towers, 10 to 40 flat based on his Q level scaling. Trundle received an E buff. Yone lost the cleanse on his E, but gained the same buff which Yasuo got in the previous, like one of the previous patches, where the crit modifier on his Q has been removed. Volibear gained a 15% bonus AD ratio on his W, the second half of it. Singed received some follow-up nerfs, and then Darius and Gwen, and I've already mentioned Gwen, received some nerfs as well. Pretty heavy patch. Let's get into it. The D tier is going to consist of the same three champions. Udyr is incredibly unpopular in the top lane. At the moment, he doesn't perform that well. His itemization is really bad in his current spot at the moment. Udyr jungle obviously tends to go with the likes of Liandry. That item is still supported relatively well for him there. The top lane, though, you don't tend to want to opt into that as much, and the nerfs for the likes of Unending Despair, Axiom Arcanist, Fimbulwinter have all really hit him quite heavily. Udyr also got nerfed quite a bit towards the end of the last bit, and this champion's just he's in a dire spot. He's in a pretty bad spot for the top lane. Sorda got buffed more recently. He has definitely improved from his buffs. He's still not a good solo laner. He's still pretty conditional. If you ever do really want to pick him here, you want to pick him into Yone when you're playing him mid lane. You want to pick him into the likes of Cassandra when you're playing him top lane. That is where Sorda's strength lies, but is still where you oftentimes see him when he is played in competitive. Maokai is one of the more underwhelming tanks of the top lane at the moment. Direct nerfs to his itemization, kind of akin to Udyr, have left him in a pretty bad spot. You don't have a huge amount of agency. You're pretty heavily reliant on your teammates just carrying you, as your champion really struggles in most lane matchups. Moving on to the C tier, then we're going to add Malzahar, because Malzahar, for the longest amount of time, has actually had a relatively consistent player base in the top lane, which doesn't really seem to shift depending on what happens patch by patch. I've always kind of I wouldn't say ignored. I've acknowledged it, but never really wanted to add him to the tier list because I just felt like he was out of place whenever I put him here. But I am going to add him. I think it's about time. He has a higher pick rate than a couple of the lower tier champions on this list. He's played more than the likes of Karmatop, which I consistently have in the top lane tier list. So Malzahar, I don't think this champion's great when you're going higher up through the ranks, but as a low elo flex pick, which you can take from mid to top lane, I think he's a pretty solid option. Has good innate wave clear, scales really well, good ultimate lockdown, and can be a good AP top laner if you want something a bit more niche within your arsenal. I imagine most of the players who play him here are pretty long-standing one tricks of the champion and really enjoy the pick. I think the champion has its strengths. Obviously, the longer lane can be punishing for him. He can be pretty prone to ganks, especially against certain junglers, but pick him in the right spots, in the right compositions, and he can be a valuable pick to have within your champion pool. Cassandra is in a pretty rough spot for solo queue at the moment. His player base has really declined quite aggressively. The current iteration of Cassandra is nowhere near as popular as the old iteration, but has equal amounts of frustration kind of around it, if not even more, because of its early game power. I think they've really blundered with the direction they've tried to take this champion, and I think he once again needs a reshape. They should shift him into being a late game champion. I don't think having a high skill early game oppressive laner tank is healthy for solo queue or competitive in that regard, and that's really where this champion is faltering at the moment. So yeah, I think he needs some shift around. In the case of Tahm Kench, Riot have kind of stated blatantly that they are just not willing to support him that much anymore. He's obviously a pretty big frustration point ever since the Tahm Kench incident, I believe towards the end of last year, where they ended up string nerfing him a couple of times because of one tweet where this champion was obviously performing quite well. A lot of it came down to the itemization as well, but they nerfed his items, so he nerfed him. He's in a pretty dire spot for where his best performing kind of area should be at the moment. I think if you still want to make this champion work, you should be just playing Heartsteel into Riftmaker. That build tends to outperform, and then you can opt into things like Proto Belt Rabadon if you want to access more AP, or you can just go standard tank variations. I wouldn't really recommend playing the champion though at the moment, but that is the direction you can take him if you are willing to play him. Some of the higher skill champions here are the likes of your Rumbles, your Jaces. These picks aren't bad, they're just very hard to play well. I think if you do pilot them well, they can be very valuable picks, and the likes of Jace and Rumble are great champions to have in your arsenal if you can pilot them well. In the case of Silas, he's a niche counter pick. If you pick him in the right spot, he can be very valuable. His spots are very limited though. You're not really picking him outside of like Malphite and Gnar situations where the ultimate gives him enough power alone to really stand and like perform quite well in the game. Swain is a good counter pick to double tank compositions where maybe you see a Scion plus Skarner top lane jungle pairing and you're really given the opportunity to play Swain. It can be really valuable in those spots. He is pretty niche, but can work really well in the spots given. Gangplank is really hard to play. He is slightly underperforming at the moment, but if you play him well, if you're like Solar Backer, for example, this champion still can perform really well in his current state. The buffs he received to his armor growth, I believe it was, more recently, did help him, allowed him to be more consistent and more durable in some of those AD matchups, which are obviously traditionally more popular in the top lane, like Garen, Aatrox, Darius, Set, for example, are all your more popular top laners, and Gangplank will do better into them now, but he still does underperform compared to other options. In Karma's case, she lost a lot of popularity. They nerfed her, 10 flat damage off her Q at all ranks in the previous patch, and her popularity really did decline quite aggressively. Still think this champion can be fine as a flex option. Blind Karma though, not really something I'd recommend anymore. Her CSing, her trading is just weaker. She won't scale or curve quite as well anymore, and I think that really did hurt the champion quite a bit. I don't think the nerfs were the right direction. It would be nice if they walked them back and went after the E-shielding, which I think is actually like one of the bigger problems with the pick at the moment, and like some of the synergies with the items she has, which makes her really oppressive as like a shield bot in the support role, and makes her just not as interactive as a champion. In the case of some of the B tier options, I'm going to lead off with Aurora, who is still incredibly good in Elite. This champion really does perform very well in the higher ranks, and I think that probably comes at the detriment to the lower ranks of Aurora, where she just doesn't perform as well as an option. She needs to consistently rotate her combos, and effectively she does have mana problems. If you do like consistently miss your windows of execution, that will be meaningful. The pick still can be really impressive in lane. Her E is practically undodgeable if you're playing a champion above a certain hitbox radius, and it just gives her a lot of power. It can be really frustrating for a lot of champions to do with this, and it can be a good AP pick within your arsenal. Case of Renekton, he's still good at shutting down specific champions, picks which are relatively squishy or have a hard time laning against his point and click W and his relatively strong level 6 to like 9, 6, 9, 13 threshold, where like he is one of the strongest champions in the game. I do think he is slightly on the weaker side in his current state and could probably do with a slight buff. What direction they would take, I don't know, but I think this pick is decent enough to not be buffed, but can be buffed and can still perform better than he currently is. Case of Ambessa, she is a she's not a pro jailed champion at the moment, but she is slowly trending in that direction. She does get picked a lot in competitive. I believe she is like third highest prior at the moment behind Rumble and Gwen. If you pick Ambessa in the right spots, she can be very powerful. She can also work as a blind if you ban out specific champions. The likes of Renekton can be hard for her. Camille is another one where if they pilot their pick row, they can be really powerful into you. Camille's in low elo though tend to not be as good at like the macro side of things, and Ambessa can punish that. I think the champion, if you can play it really well, is very powerful. Definitely like one of the highest options in the game at the moment. For solo queue and for like mid elo, which is what I recommend picks for, I don't really recommend Ambessa. I think this champion does have quite the skill curve, and I would recommend other things which are a bit more consistent over her at the moment. In the case of Gragas, he's a good AP blind option. He does have pretty severe mana problems, especially early on into the game. But if you can get past that, you carve really well into the mid and late game, picking up like Lost Chapter, Fiendish Codex, getting access to a lot of haste can be really powerful on this champion. And I think that is where the real strength of this pick lies. He's pretty agnostic into most lane matchups. He in fact can find kill angles on most lane matchups once you get access to like your first 2-3 components within the game. Gragas, I'd say, is a solid B tier option at the moment. Yasuo is an incredibly slept on power pick at the moment. In the right matchup, this champion is one of the best in the game. He can really heavily nullify a lot of the ranged top laners, and if you pick him into like your Nars, your Auroras, if they are ever blinded, Yasuo can be really favourable in those situations. He is hard to pilot, that is something you do have to be aware of. I'd recommend playing the likes of Bork into Shieldbow IE, but things like Yuntaos and Strybreaker and Krakenslayer do have their spots where they can function. I'm just not as I'm not going to recommend them as much as just the core build, because I think the core build is just the most consistent way of playing him at the moment. So I think it's a decent pick. He's a good blind option. I would only really ever recommend playing him as a blind option if you choose to use Sion as a counter pick. He can work, but you traditionally want to play him as like a tank blind, as that is where the real value of the pick lies. You are playing weak side, you can just catch waves, you can find kill angles on laners by quite a margin. This pick does do a lot of early game damage, which I think a lot of people are is pretty deceptive from the champion, considering he technically is an infinite scaler, but I'd say a lot of his power is actually shifted towards his early game pop with the W, and like the shield bash value, the grass value, like Q snaps can all add up to quite a bit of like poke within lane. Case of Fiora, she's a good counter pick. She is still very hard to play, but yeah, if you can play her well, she still has an immense amount of value. You just have to pick in the right spots and make sure you're getting the kind of resources and like you're sieging and getting the gold where you really do need it within the game. In the case of Vayne, another really good counter pick in the right spot. She can also output a huge amount of damage and be really valuable within team fights. She can be really oppressive in lane, and certain champions just can't really play against her mobility and her damage which she can output. In the case of Nasus, I think this pick in a good counter pick spot where you know you're not really going to be dove is really, really powerful. Getting access to level 9 and like a decent amount of haste early, like your Sheen Lucid pairing or your Sheen into like Full Trinity or Frozen Heart combo gives this champion a lot of power, and I think he's in a really good spot at the moment, like as a counter pick. Not blindable though. His E lost a lot of power. It definitely makes him a lot worse when trying to pick him early on into the game, but as a counter pick he can definitely have a lot of value. In the case of Ryze, another pretty good counter pick, can be just a good generic AP option to your pool. Most people won't expect him to go top lane, and that is definitely a strength of the champion. Jax is a great option for anti-auto attack based matchups. Counter-Strike is one of the most powerful abilities for like just a top laner kind of access to. He can nullify a lot of lanes. He can proxy really well if that is something which you're interested in doing, and just like working behind tower, denying waves, and then like or playing like a phase rush AP style. There are obviously different builds you can opt into on this champion, and I think he's in a pretty solid spot. Not the best state Jax has ever been in, but definitely with the buffs he received not too long ago has found his footing as a pretty solid B tier option. In competitive, he is pretty close to S tier at the moment, just not quite there because of some of the power picks in the game at the moment. Tryndamere, pretty I mean, just unhealthy playstyle for the game. Like, if you do want to play someone which is just all about sieging and then sustaining off the wave and then just war of attrition and just keep rotating the same kind of playstyle into most matchups, then Tryndamere is a pretty solid option for that kind of playstyle. His variance just isn't really there at the moment, and I think his build is pretty, just unhealthy for the game. But yeah, if you enjoy that, it can definitely be a good way of climbing at the moment. Alawi is an incredibly low skew champion in her current state. She is really reliant on just rotating ease onto this, like a target, which can be really polarizing for certain tank matchups, which their unit size kind of just prohibits them from dodging them consistently. Into some of the harder matchups, though, Alawi just feels useless as a champion and really does struggle to come online. You do just have to try and snowball and siege on side lane as much as possible, and I think the pick is just in a pretty bad spot in her general state at the moment. In the case of Varus, he is still a very good ranged option in the top lane, being able to opt into durability, damage, having a pretty split profile in magic and AD, depending on like what you're opting into. Is really hard to itemize against, and most lanes can't play against him. Biggest vulnerability of Varus is always going to be his weakness to ganks. If you consistently chain gank a Varus, this champion will fall behind and will end up being useless within the game. So definitely something to be cognitive of, but if you ward up correctly, your jungle is playing around you, Varus is a very good pick at the moment. Case of Akali, she's a great counter pick option, a great AP assassin in the top lane. I think she does have some pretty heavy value as a pick here. If you want to add her to your arsenal, she's definitely a very solid option. Can be played into the likes of Gwen and Olaf to pretty high success. Definitely can struggle into some of the tankier targets, and if you're not accelerated within the game, will feel pretty bad compared to other options. But if you're really dominating in lane against a matchup which can't really play against your Shroud and your mobility, Akali can be a great option. Malphite is a good R5. Outside of that, I don't really recommend playing the champion at the moment. I think the overall weakness of Formo and a lot of the tank items this pick has really suffered from. If they were to buff Sunfire or they were to buff Formo, I think Malphite really does shoot up in priority. At the moment, no, I'd only really recommend him as an R5. You don't really need to put games into him. He's pretty he's pretty standard on how he plays. You just poke with Q if you have the likes of Arcane Comet and Mana Flow up. If you're not playing that build and you're playing the W Max grass build, you just look for grass trades when your W is up, and it's a very simplistic play pattern and can be very easily just learn on the fly if you are playing him as like a counter pick champion. In the case of Gnar, I still think this pick is really good if you're able to consistently be on sides, sieging against towers, if you're able to get access to like your Trinity Cleaver pairing. This pick is very, very powerful. He scales decently. Not one of the best scalers in the top lane, but definitely if you get access to a lot of items and you're getting your levels, this champion can do a huge amount of damage in team fights. His ultimate is a very powerful tool, and the fact that he has access to so many different play patterns really does give him a lot of strength. Vladimir is a great counter pick option in the right matchup. This champion does a huge amount within games. He can individually carry games with the right amount of gold. Obviously, in some of the harder matchups, he can definitely be punished, and people will punish you if you're not able to consistently rotate Qs, and won't give you access to empowered Q as consistently. But still, I think this champion, if you play him as a counter pick, is very powerful and a great AP option in the right spot. Mundo is doing a lot better. The buff towards him and Warmogs has really helped him. Getting access to like an early Warmogs really can nullify some of the harder lanes. Obviously, the nerfs towards Heartsteel did hurt that item, and rushing Heartsteel does feel quite bad if you're not able to consistently like stay in lane and you're not going to be able to get the stacks which you maybe want from rushing it. Getting it second is going to obviously stump the stacks. That will be meaningful, and you won't scale as well if you are rushing Warmogs. But if you can get to late game as Mundo, which is like the main thing as on this champion, getting to like level 16, 17, 18, Mundo is still an incredibly powerful champion. He still scales incredibly well, and the changes he's received more recently have definitely helped him solidify his spot as a high B tier. Probably gonna get bumped up to the A tier champion soon at the moment. In the case of Shen, he received the 10 to 40 flat damage on towers. It's pretty meaningless. It's nice quality of life. I think Shen still needs more. If anything, I think his ult shield is pretty underwhelming. They probably overswung when they last nerfed it. I would like to see some level of like drawback on that. Like they give some level of compensation, because I think the pick is just in a pretty weak spot at the moment. He really does suffer from itemization problems. I think a lot of his core items have been nerfed, which has left him in a pretty rough spot. If they were to buff his items, I think that's another way Shen could definitely rise back up as a solid option. Right now though, he's a counter pick to the likes of Camille and some of the other auto attack based matchups. He's pretty reliant on team. He doesn't have a huge amount of individual agency. But he's a high B. I don't think this champion's unplayable. I just think he's considerably weaker compared to where he has been in previous seasons. Moving up from the B tier to the A tier. Actually, one champion moving up from the C tier to the B tier is Yone. I have him at the top of the B tier. He could probably be pushed to the A tier. I haven't quite decided yet. This champion really benefited from his the crit modifier being reduced. Obviously, when they did that, it just means the champion scales even better now. Getting access to second, third item means so much more. Obviously, the cleanse change is annoying for Yone mains. It's an incredibly elite skew change, though. In 90% of games, even more, but 95% of games of where Yone is played, he is just strictly buffed. You won't buffer the CC as consistently, or like Yone, for example, will be weaker against Morgana if there is a Morgana in the game, and Yone ease to like dodge the Morgana Q, and you are still snared when you like come back out, and like when you come back as your E, then yeah, it's meaningful. That will definitely hurt him, but for the most part, in most games, you're not going to notice it. You're not going to be playing against that level of CC. You're still having the travel duration on the E, which will still obviously cut into the CC time. And I think Rion is just strictly a better champion, and he sits towards the high end of the B tier. You could argue in certain elite matchups that Rion will be weaker, and yeah, I agree, but for the most part, he is stronger in 95% of scenarios. In the case of Trundle, he gets bumped up to the A tier. He is doing better. The buffs to his E were meaningful, and yeah, it allows him to more consistently chase down opponents. That 4% additional slow can be another auto, and yeah, that's meaningful. This champion obviously tends to just act as a split pusher, kind of akin to the likes of Tryndamere, but yeah, getting access to a bit more value on the E helped him, and yeah, it bumps him up to the A tier. Neferi stays within the A tier. I actually don't know where to really place this champion because it got nerfed and then they nerfed it again. But the original nerfs were because they kind of didn't really do enough in the previous patch. So I think this pick could probably be dropped onto the B tier. And if her popularity just completely dies in the top lane, we'll probably just end up getting removed. For the moment, though, I will leave her in the A tier. I still think this champion is very good. The nerfs were meaningful, though, so definitely be aware that the champion might not actually be A tier, might be more like a B tier option as the patch continues. For Ornn, I think he could sit as a high B tier, low A tier option. I think the champion has issues. It struggles into a lot of matchups, but there's no doubt about the fact that in low elo, where the games go longer, this champion will innately gain value. He has access to a lot of crowd control, and that can be a very valuable thing within the top lane. Obviously, you are giving up agency when you play champions like Ornn, Zac, Shen, but you are gaining some level of scaling, and you're gaining a tank within the team, which can be really valuable if you have a consistent hyper carry, or you're duoing with someone who very much knows that they can carry games if like someone is on a tank for the most part. That being said, Volibear sits within the A tier. The 15% AD ratio buff to his W is nice. It's not enough to really push him back up to the S tier, but he remains as an A tier option. In the case of Quinn, she benefited from the Symbiotic Souls buff. She benefited from her being directly buffed. She benefited from Electrocute being buffed. She's just benefited from a lot of systems being changed around her, and she sits as a solid A tier option. The changes to Home Guard this patch were meaningful, like it's going to hurt chain resetting champions, but you're still gaining access to relatively similar power as pre-patch, and yeah, Quinn sits as more like an A tier, low A tier option. Doesn't really change from being a low A tier option. Pantheon, great counterpick champion in the top lane, but is incredibly snowball reliant. Needs to be advantageous early to really get value within the game. In the case of Kennen, he's a pretty slept on AP option in the top lane at the moment. Obviously, his unpopularity comes from the fact that he can be very frustrating to play. I think his auto windup is one of the worst remaining ones in the game at the moment. It can be very hard to like work around because I'm pretty sure the amount of the animation which needs to go through is pretty sluggish. That being said, though, I think getting access to like a large amount of AP items on this champion, his ultimate is an incredibly powerful ability, and Electrocute being buffed was really nice on him. But things like First Strike and Airy can be really good in the right spots. He really benefits from Liandry at the moment. I think Liandry rush on Kennen makes his champion even better in his current state, and a lot of people and just players in general have realized that Liandry and just health stacking on a lot of these majors is doing really well at the moment. It's why Roa is really performing like even better now with the buffs to it, but was picking up a lot of traction on the likes of Ahri. Other picks here are Poppy. Poppy obviously got a bunch of changes to kind of push her away from support to top lane again, and she's found herself in a pretty solid spot. She obviously scales a lot better now, but has a considerably weaker laning phase. She can still perform really well into the matchups where she is like good as a counter pick, and that is where I'd only really recommend playing her as a champion. I wouldn't recommend blinding Poppy, but in good counter pick matchups, this champion is still very strong. Zac, great tank option, obviously very unpopular. Most people won't understand how to play against him correctly. Obviously, from the non-Zac side of things, you want to deny his blobs. As Zac, you want to pick up your blobs so you can sustain through most lanes. He scales pretty mediocrely. Like, you are a mid-game champion more than anything when you're playing Zac top, but if you can get access to like a Sunfire, you're like a +1 item, then yeah, Zac can be a really solid top lane option. In the case of Wukong, pretty niche. Same goes for Kled. Both these and Heimerdinger. All three of these options in the right spots can be really good, especially if you're an OTP of the champion, which these three champions mostly come down to. If you are an OTP Heimerdinger Kled, you will make them work even in matchups which aren't like suited for you, purely because you understand the limitations of your pick and where they really shine as champions. Kled, I think, really good if you are looking for an aggressive early game dive champion. In the case of Camille and Riven and Aurelia, these picks are really powerful if you pilot them well. In the case of Camille, she's, I'd say, probably the most matchup dependent of the champions, but they're all pretty heavily matchup dependent. If you play them well, though, you'll pick them into everything, and you'll oftentimes be able to forge leads, which maybe the standard or just non-Aurelia player would be able to, because you understand, once again, kind of like the other OTP champions, the limitations of your pick, except for these ones are a lot more popular and have a lot more kind of like resources to kind of work with. In the case of Teemo, I still think this pick is a solid A2 option. He still scales incredibly well. A great mid to low elo pick. Does struggle a lot more in high elo, where people will sweep your shrooms. They won't allow you to get as many resources, and that can definitely be a limitation of a champion when he doesn't have any sort of hard CC to work with. The two high A2 options, which honestly I could probably bump Aatrox up to the S tier. I'm going to leave him in the A2 at the moment. And I think Garen's probably more of a low A2 option with the nerfs to his crit ratio on his E, which was in the previous patch. Definitely did hurt him. In the case of Aatrox, though, he's performing really well at the moment, has access to a load of different build variations. And I think people are beginning to catch on to the real, like, genuine strength of this champion. You can opt into things like Cyclosword, Shojin, you can do standard bruiser builds, we've seen lethality builds, you can opt into like Electrocute, there was like Phase Rush, Grasp, Conqueror variations. There's just so many ways you can play Aatrox in his current state, and I think he's in a really solid spot for a champion. Dropping down is Singed, who probably got over-nerfed this patch. I wouldn't be surprised if they compensation buff him in the next patch. Right now, though, he's definitely not doing as well as he would be, like as he traditionally is, and probably sits more with the other OTP A-tier picks. In the case of Darius and Gwen, Gwen probably could honestly drop down to the B tier for like mid to low elo play. Still an incredibly good high elo champion. They really like went quite hard with the re-elite skewing of this pick, or like early game skewing, competitive skewing, whatever you want to call it, with this champion. And yeah, she definitely performs a lot better there now. I'm gonna have her as a low A2 option. I still think this pick is like pretty solid as like a mid to high elo champion, but not something I'd really recommend for the lower ranks. In the case of Darius, he did lose some genuine power this patch, losing 2 seconds on E at all ranks combined with 2 armor will hurt him when most of the popular top lane matchups are AD champions. He probably sits more like a mid A tier option now. Moving up from the A to the S tier is Olaf. So Olaf got buffed this patch. The cast time on E went down with his attack speed, scaling from 0 to 125% attack speed, which is really meaningful. If you can get access to another Autonomous champion or another E cast, you are gaining a sizable amount of damage, and that for a champion like Olaf, where getting access to more damage can be the difference between winning and surviving a fight or losing a fight, then yeah, it's meaningful. He jumps up to the S tier. I think in the right spots, this champion is an incredibly powerful pick against like the right compositions, against the right matchups, where his ultimate can really deny a lot of their kit. And if you pair with an enchanter, this champion is a monster. Some of the other picks within the S tier are the likes of Kale, who still scales incredibly well, and for mid to low elo, where the game's go considerably longer. Kale is perfect for that environment. The changes Sue received towards the end of last split and the changes this season really benefited her, and Kale, one of the biggest winners at the moment of just the overall kind of direction the game has lent in. Cassiopeia is an incredibly good counter pick. The buff to Roa really helped her quite a bit this patch as well. Is going to be some genuine power, getting access to a stronger catalyst and a stronger first item does mean something, especially for a champion which wants to be playing a bit more mid-range. Still want to play as a counter pick, but yeah, the buffs to Roa this patch will definitely help her. Cho'Gath is what I'd recommend as the premier tank of the patch. You can just play him as a standard tank, and he can perform quite well. You can obviously play the Halo Blade Shrelia version, which gives him a lot more damage, does sacrifice some durability, and is a bit more unique in terms of its playstyle. Obviously, like wanting to rush symbiotic souls and then just playing around, shoving waves and then roaming around the map, like using your ultimate to really secure kills. But yeah, I think this champion is a very solid S tier pick at the moment. Some of the more traditional kind of like juggernauts of the top lane are your Mordekaisers and your Sets. I think these picks are still really good. Obviously, better the lower down you go, where people will oftentimes give you the kills and the play patterns which you want to really succeed in the game. I think these picks really do struggle quite a bit the higher up you go. Like once you go Diamond Plus, people won't give you the same level of angles and the same gold to kind of allow like one-shot Ws with Set, or like permanent ultimate uptime with Mordekaiser, where you are just able to get a takedown and then use that to really snowball your advantage within the game. The other three champions here are Yorick, who ended up weaker this patch, but they ended up hotfix buffing him, and I'm pretty sure jungle Yorick might be the strongest thing in the game at the moment, so definitely worth checking that out. I would really recommend trying jungle Yorick if you do play a lot of Yorick. Yorick top is better though, and with the changes, and jumps up to the S tier. Obviously, I imagine they will do some follow-up changes to Yorick. I don't think this is a good spot for him to have landed, where he is the strongest jungler in the game, and I think he did end up overshooting for top lane as well. But yeah, jumps up to the S tier. In case of Warwick, he sits as the highest S tier option. I think Warwick is an incredibly powerful early game champion. He's an incredibly low elo skewed pick and very predicated on early game advantages, but you will consistently get them. People will not respect this champion's damage, the healing, and the dive threat. They will give him like an early first item. He will carve that into sieging towers, picking champions off around the map, and it can be really frustrating to play against this pick, and he is very deserving of a high S tier option. And then the pick, which is always with my S plus tier, and still is Urgot. The nerfs to Darius and Gwen benefit him. Obviously, these were two popular champions, which ended up being nerfed. That combined with the likes of well, I mean, in the case of Shem being buffed, that also does help him. He does struggle into the likes of Yone and Olaf, though. So, I mean, Olaf is my current ban. I think Olaf, especially when you go like mid to high master, is a very frustrating champion to play against this Urgot. Urgot does win it early, like actually pre-6, Urgot can win that matchup. It's a pretty unique thing, but if Olaf doesn't give you that angle, then he runs the matchup, and it's really hard to play against a champion like that. So Urgot is my pick of the patch. Usually is. I still think Urgot's an incredible champion. Olaf is probably my recommended ban if you are playing Urgot. If you want to play other things though, I think like especially going from like gold to diamond at the moment, then like Set, Mordekaiser, Yorick, Warwick, Kale are all really good options. If you're looking for something to OTP and you want something which can curve a bit better into master, then Aurelia, Camille, Riven can all be really solid options. I think Aatrox definitely a pretty good pick at the moment. And yeah, those are my thoughts. So thank you guys for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.